Hello, welcome back to Azure Terraformer. Today we're going to be setting up a site-to-site VPN using my Ubiquiti UniFi UDMP, or a UniFi Dream Machine Pro. It's a common firewall slash network appliance that pretty much handles everything that you need for home and for small business. We are going to be connecting it to Azure, an Azure Virtual Network, using Azure's site-to-site VPN connectivity. And to do that, we'll have to do some things in Azure, and then we'll have to do some things in the on-premise environment, configuring the network appliance through the UniFi console. So without further ado, let's get started. We're going to start in Terraform, and we're going to set up everything that we need out in Azure. And then we'll look at dropping into the UniFi console to set things up there to get things ready. So I have a basic project stubbed out here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to stub out a simple network. I need a virtual network. We're just going to give it a very generic address space. If you're doing this for real, especially within a corporate environment, you're going to want to make sure that there's no conflicts out in your network. I don't have any. I don't have any networks that are out in Azure right now, so I can pretty much use whatever I want. Now, in later episodes, when we go and build out our main network, and then we attach the site-to-site VPN to that network, I'll probably want to be more thoughtful and more prudent about how big my CIDR block is or my address space is. In that situation. But for right now, I think we're good. So the next thing I need is a subnet, and the subnet is going to be for just utility purposes. I'm just going to drop like a VM in here just for testing. Now, in order to set the stage for my virtual network gateway, I need to set up a special subnet. Now in Azure, this is a convention that's commonly used to identify special subnets. And one of the reasons why I put my starting prefix a little bit away from, the apex 0.0, I put it at 3.0. It's because, I like to put those special subnets kind of close together at the apex of whatever my base address is within the virtual network. Now today I'm only going to be using one, but we've used some of these on previous episodes. Bastion host has its own special subnet that you have to set up in order to make Bastion host work. There's other examples, but today we're going to be setting up a gateway subnet. So there we go. I have my gateway subnet set up, and I have a utility subnet set up where I can put virtual machines in and stuff like that. So I'm pretty much done with my net. Now let's set up the gateway itself. Now the resource that I'm going to be using to do that is called a virtual network gateway. And a virtual network gateway's structure has a virtual network gateway connection, and then you can associate a local network gateway. The local network gateway is a reference to whatever you have on premise and needs to be configured with that in mind. So the virtual network gateway is pretty much what's in Azure. The local network gateway is what's on premise within whatever environment that you're trying to connect it to. And then you need to make a connection between the two. So first of all, let me declare my virtual network gateway. Now, what I've just configured is the most simple virtual network gateway that you can set up. I'm not using active-active. That would imply redundancy within the VPN connection, which for an enterprise situation is what you're going to need, most likely. I'm only setting this up from my home to Azure for my lab environments, so this is not going to be any robust. There's no expectations of robustness here, so I don't need active-active. I don't need to pay for active-active. And enable BGP. I don't plan on doing any super fancy networking rules. So I'm not going to be enabling BGP. and I'm using route-based VPN, which is like very simple. And then the SKUs are probably the most odd, aspect of this. They all have numbers. You kind of have to look up. They're just magic strings essentially, and they have a number attached to them. VPN gateway 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you just kind of have to look at the spec for the SKU to see what it is, because it really doesn't tell you what's going on in there at all. Like a virtual machine SKU might give some inkling of how big it is, or something like that. But yeah, these are literally just magic strings. Now, the last thing that you need for your virtual network gateway is you need an IP address, and this needs to be a public IP address, because the whole point of a site-to-site VPN is that you're taking this on-premise network and you want to connect it to this remote network. Now, this on-premise network is connected to the internet, and you're going to use the VPN over the internet to connect to that network out in Azure. And so in order for this on-premise network to be able to see your network out in Azure, there has to be some sort of access point that's available on the internet that this thing on-premise can see. And that's where this public IP address comes in. This public IP address is the endpoint where your local network is going to reach out, talk to the VPN endpoint, and shake hands with it, and then establish that connection. So this is a super important concept to understand, and a super important aspect of the solution. So what that requires is an IP configuration block on our virtual network gateway. And this looks a lot like an IP configuration block that you would put on a NIC, right? I mean, it's going to be pretty similar to that. So we're going to link it to a subnet. We're going to link it to a PIP. Now, I did not declare a PIP, so I'm going to have to do that, but let's just get this kind of set up here. Now, you will notice that I left a placeholder empty string for my PIP, and I linked my IP configuration to the gateway subnet. That's why we have that special gateway subnet. It is literally here for this virtual network gateway to attach to. So keep that in mind when you are sizing that subnet. Anyways, let's go declare that PIP, and let's link it down to our virtual network gateway. I tend to like to declare PIP resources above the resources that they get attached to, even though this is kind of like an inverse parent-child relationship. But I feel like the PIP, like knowing that there's a PIP, is kind of really important context for a particular resource. And it's a small enough resource that it's almost like a disclaimer, like, hey, get ready. We've got a resource that is publicly accessible. Hence, I like to have the PIP up front and visible to myself and to future readers that are going to be looking at my code in the future. So if you're wondering why I'm putting, this lesser resource above the main course, which is the virtual network gateway, that's kind of my thinking, and that's why I'm doing it. So just thought I'd throw that out there. Now you'll notice that I named my PIP gateway, and I named my gateway main. Now my thinking in this situation, this is what I call kind of contextual object reference naming in Terraform. The name of the object is relative to the resource that it's going to be associated with. So for public IP address, I might have more than one PIP, right? But I'm definitely not going to have more than one virtual network gateway. So with virtual network gateway, I can just call it main, because that's the main show. There will be no other. But for PIP, this is a specific PIP. There may be more PIPs due to the nature of that resource, and this PIP is specifically for one purpose, the gateway. So that's kind of my thinking in terms of the naming of that resource here. Okay, so I have my PIP set up. Now what I need to do is I need to set up my local network gateway. So let's go set up the local network gateway. So now remember, the local network gateway represents my on-premise network. So there's going to be a lot of stuff in here that's related to my on-premise network. First of all, the gateway address for my local network gateway, not my virtual network gateway in Azure, but my local network gateway, 2 gateways, one to the local environment or on-premise, one to the Azure environment or the remote environment. And just like the Azure environment has a internet addressable IP address, so does my on-premise network. And that on-premise network is my public IP address that's provided to me by my internet service provider. So we're gonna have to get that. Now my address space is whatever my network appliance that I'm using on premise to create my local network on premise. Now this is gonna be like a NAT CIDR block. Usually 192.168, but it could also be a 10.0. something. So you're going to want to pay attention to your network appliance and how it's been configured to set these up. And so on my network, I'm just using 192.168, and we'll plug in the values here. But I need to create the variables first, so let's go create these variables. Okay, and so local address space is just going to be 192.168.1.0/24. This is a pretty common namespace, pretty common address space. Again, yours might be 10.0.0.0/24 or whatever it is. You just have to go look on your network appliance to see what value should go there. But it's important. This is not an IP address. This is a CIDR block. So it's a range of IP addresses. And in this case, we have a /24. That means there's 256 IP addresses, starting at 0, going to 255. This is what most people need within their home network. Like this might change over time, but most people don't have anywhere close to 256 network devices on their home network. I actually come pretty close. I have every access point that I have has its own IP address. I have about 5 or 6 around my house. My NAS has, I think, several IP addresses, different computers. I have different iPads. I have phones, of course, for my family. And then I have Alexa devices. Those devices are going to be having their own IP address because they're connected. Smart TVs, all the things. I have a Tesla. It's going to have its own IP address when it connects. So all that stuff. So there's more and more things are joining the network, either wirelessly or wired. So that 256 may not always be a good rule of thumb in the future. For right now, I'm not even like hitting the edge there. So I think we're probably okay. And then the other thing that I need, and I'm putting it in a secret variable here, is my local IP address here, because I just don't want to check this into my GitHub. But here is the public IP address that my ISP provides to me, and I've just put that in here. And then we've got this pre-shared key. Now this pre-shared key, if you recall, we've set up a local network that represents our on-premise. We've set up our remote network, which represents Azure, and now we need to create a connection between them so that a handshake can take place. So we need to define what that handshake looks like. So we'll go back here and we'll use this pre-shared key when we go do that. So let me go set up a variable for that. And so now, when I'm declaring I've got my remote network here, I've got my local network here, and so now I need to create a connection between them. So the connection that I want to set up is actually on the remote network. So the resource for that kind of follows a naming convention where you've got the parent resource type followed by a suffix. So it's called the Azure RM Virtual Network Gateway connection. And we will just call this main, because we're only going to have one connection. There will only be one. Okay, so this is my connection information, and a lot of this stuff probably won't make much sense, but these are some basic settings that are going to work for us. of course, like the AES 256 should probably, be familiar. SHA-1 should be familiar as well. AES 256 is a symmetric encryption strategy with 256-bit encryption. So these are basically configuring that encrypted channel that we make from the on-premise environment to the Azure environment. And we are using an IPSec connection and IPv2. So now I have pretty much set up everything that I need from an Azure standpoint side. So I'm going to start running this, and I'm going to start running this, and then we are going to drop into the UniFi console and configure our on-premise network. Okay, so while this is cooking, I'm going to drop into the UniFi console and configure the local network on my UDMP. Let me go to network. I'm going to go over to settings. Here's my beautiful network. And let me go to teleport and VPN, and I'm going to go down here to site-to-site VPN. I'm going to hit create new, and now I'm going to give this thing a name. I'm just going to call this Azure VPN. We are going to use a pre-shared key. I don't like that. I have to go use the pre-shared key that I was using before. So I'm going to snag that and put that in there. It automatically pulled the local IP address. This is the PIP for my local network. So I don't need to change that. My Ubiquiti UDMP Pro or UDMP, my UDMP knows what the WAN address is that I get from my ISP because it's managing my network. My shared remote subnets, I can get as specific here as I want, but remember I just set up a /16, so I can just do that. Now the remote IP address is a piece of data that I need, which I don't have yet. I need to go out and kind of wait for that PIP to be provisioned. So if I go look here, and the PIP is provisioned, so I'm going to go check that out. And this is the PIP for my virtual network gateway, and that's what the remote IP is going to be. So 20.245, there we go. Okay, now I'm going to flip over to manual because I don't like all these settings. Because if you go look at auto, it's going to use IPv1, it's going to use 128. So I want to make sure that if you remember, all of these settings kind of correlate to that Azure Virtual Network Gateway connection block that I configured. Of course, they don't map they don't map exactly. So you kind of have to use a little bit of skullduggery to kind of figure out which one goes to which. So here I've got encryption. This is AES 256. My hash is SHA-1, and then I've got 1414, that's fine, and then PFS I think is fine to enable route-based VPN. Yes, we set that up. So I think I'm pretty good with these settings. So let me just save that, and we'll get it going. Let's go check on Terraform and see where it is. And it looks like it's still creating our virtual network gateway. So we can go out there and just hit smash refresh and see where we're at. The virtual network gateway, I will warn you, does take some time. It can take upwards to 30 minutes. So this is not something that you want to provision a whole bunch or have a lot of churn when you do. So I would highly recommend, if you're going to set up a site-to-site VPN, you should set up a separate Terraform project that pretty much only provisions this thing, because you do not want anything to destabilize this thing. Number one, it'll disconnect. If you have to create this thing, it's going to cause a disruption to your network connection. Number two, it just takes a long time to delete and create one of these things. So it's definitely one of those resources that, due to the heavyweightness of it, you want to have it, in a very small blast radius, so that really no nothing that is that is unrelated to this should be provisioned alongside this thing, because it should be black boxed. I'll leave it at that. So now we wait.
A few moments later.
Okay, so the connection, both the gateway and the connection are done. Let's go check the health in the portal. So there's my connection right there. My virtual network gateway is listed right here. And if I go check this out, the status is unknown. Ooh. Did you see that? There's an Ike V1. Did I make a goof? Oh my God. How did it get to Ike V1? So apparently I had fat fingered Ike V1 in there, and it doesn't work. But it just shows you really have to make sure, like when you set these things up manually, you have to make sure everything is lined up perfectly. So you really have to make sure every setting is lined up exactly right, and just double check everything. You gotta be careful, just chasing your tail and like changing a whole bunch of things without testing and retesting every small change that you make. Otherwise, you'll introduce so much drift to the environment that you'll just have no idea how to get back to the known good state. So I hope you found this helpful. We connected my local network to my Azure network using a remote virtual network gateway and a local network gateway on Azure. We used Ike v2, AES 256-bit encryption, and we set up a Linux VM, which I can now ping from my local network and ping out and hit that Linux VM that's running in Azure. So I hope you like this video. Do you use UniFi? What do you use as your home network appliance, or what do you use at work? I'd like to know. Have you tried setting up a site-to-site VPN to make it a little bit more efficient to communicate with your resources in Azure? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, this is the Azure Terraformer signing off.